When people talk about garage beginnings, they picture something almost romantic: a couple of friends, a dusty room, a wild idea, and destiny quietly smiling in the background. But what they don't tell you is that a garage is not a symbol of creativity. It is a symptom of constraint, a place you end up when no one believes enough to give you space, money, or legitimacy. And I know this because my first office wasn't a garage, with a myth attached to it. It was whatever corner I could afford to occupy without being asked to leave. The stories of tech giants love to start in garages because it makes success feel accessible, almost inevitable. But the truth is that a garage is where ambition goes to be tested, stripped of comfort, stripped of excuses, and stripped of the illusion that brilliance alone is enough. In those early days, nothing feels historic. Nothing feels like the beginning of an empire. It feels like improvisation, like desperation dressed up as optimism, like telling yourself this cramped, poorly lit space is temporary, because believing anything else would crush you. The untold part of these beginnings is that garages are quiet witnesses to doubt, to arguments whispered late at night, to founders staring at walls, wondering if they have mistaken stubbornness for vision, and that silence is heavier than any later applause. I've sat in rooms like that, watching condensation form on cold concrete walls, listening to the hum of cheap hardware, knowing that every hour spent there was a gamble against time, money, and the patience of everyone who loved me enough to worry. What history edits out is how close these beginnings are to ending before they ever become stories worth telling. Because for every garage that becomes legendary, there are thousands that become storage units. Again, holding nothing but abandoned prototypes and regret. The founders we celebrate didn't wake up believing they were building giants. They woke up trying not to fail. Today, trying to make something work well enough to buy themselves another week of hope. The garage is where ego gets corrected quickly, because there is no audience to impress, no title to hide behind, only the raw output of your work and the brutal feedback of reality. I remember thinking more than once that if this was truly meant to be something big, it wouldn't feel this fragile, this close to collapsing under the weight of a single missed payment or a single bad decision. And yet that fragility is exactly what forges the habits that later look like genius. From the outside, the obsession with efficiency, the intolerance for waste, the ability to do 10 jobs at once, because hiring even one person feels like jumping off a cliff. The garage is where founders learn to stretch time, to trade sleep for progress, to turn ignorance into curiosity instead of fear, and to accept that progress often looks like tinkering, not breakthroughs. Tech giants were not born from grand strategies. They were born from relentless iteration in spaces that smelled like oil dust and anxiety, where every improvement was hard-won and every mistake felt personal. The myth suggests these founders had unwavering belief. But belief in those conditions is rarely pure. It is mixed with doubt, with moments of imagining an easier life, with the quiet shame of explaining to relatives why you are still working on that thing. What keeps people going in garages is not certainty, but momentum, the small satisfaction of making something slightly better than it was yesterday, because that improvement becomes proof, however fragile, that quitting today would be premature. I've watched partnerships form and fracture in those spaces, watched co-founders realize their visions were aligned only until stress revealed their differences. Watched trust erode, not from malice, but from exhaustion and fear. And those breakups rarely make it into the origin stories, even though they shape the company as much as any early product decision. The garage teaches you uncomfortable truths about yourself, how you handle pressure when there is no safety net, how you respond when progress stalls, whether you default to blame or responsibility, and those lessons don't disappear. When the company grows, they just resurface in more expensive ways, People love to say that constraints breed creativity, but what they really breed is focus. Because when you have nothing, you stop fantasizing and start prioritizing. And that discipline becomes the invisible architecture behind later success. In those early environments, founders learn to listen to users, not because it's fashionable, but because they have no choice. Because survival depends on solving a real problem well enough that someone is willing to pay for it. The garage strips away the noise of trends and hype, leaving only the uncomfortable question of whether what you're building actually matters to anyone outside your own head. I remember moments when the gap between effort and results felt insulting, when weeks of work produced nothing but a slightly less broken version of the same thing. And the temptation to quit didn't arrive as despair, but as reason, as a calm, logical argument that this path made no sense. This is the part of the story that never makes it into documentaries. The internal negotiations with yourself, the rationalizations for stopping the bargains you strike just to keep going a little longer. Tech giants were not born from inspiration alone. They were born from founders who learned how to outlast their own doubts, how to sit with uncertainty without needing immediate validation. The garage is where time moves strangely. Days blur together. Progress feels both slow and consuming, and your world shrinks to the size of the problem you're trying to solve, isolating you from normal life in ways that are hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. And yet, it is in that isolation that clarity sometimes emerges, not as a lightning bolt, but as a gradual understanding of what matters and what doesn't, of which features are noise and which are essential, of which relationships strengthen you and which drain you. When success eventually arrives, if it does, people point back to the garage as if it were a sacred birthplace. But they rarely acknowledge that most founders would have gladly traded that romantic beginning for stability, for reassurance, for a sign that they weren't wasting years of their lives. The irony is that those beginnings only gain meaning in retrospect, once survival has been secured, once the story has an ending worth packaging. In the moment, a garage is just a place where you fight obscurity, where you confront the possibility that your idea might never escape those walls, and where the only thing separating future legend from forgotten experiment is the decision to show up again tomorrow. I've learned that the true legacy of garage beginnings is not the physical space, but the mindset forged within it. The comfort with discomfort, the bias toward action, the skepticism of glamour, and the respect for fundamentals that no amount of later success can erase. These are the invisible roots of tech giants, grown not in fertile soil, but in cracks, in neglected corners, where ambition had to force its way through concrete and doubt. And just when you think this phase is about to end, when the first hints of outside interest appear, when someone finally takes a meeting, when the idea of leaving that cramped space starts to feel real, a new fear creeps in quietly. Because stepping out of the garage means stepping into scrutiny, into expectations, into a world that will no longer judge you on effort alone, but on outcomes. And that realization hangs in the air as you pack up wires and notebooks. Understanding that the garage was not just a beginning, but a shelter, and that leaving it will require you to face a much harsher environment where the mistakes cost more, the stakes are higher, and the next phase of the journey will test you in ways the garage never could. Because the moment you open that door and step forward, you are no longer just someone with an idea hiding from the world. You are someone about to find out whether what you built in that cramped, unforgiving space is strong enough to survive what comes next. And that question lingers as you take a breath. Look back one last time and step out, knowing that everything you learned inside those walls is about to be challenged, and that the story, far from reaching a conclusion, is only just beginning as you move forward into the next stage, carrying with you the habits, the scars, and the hard-earned clarity forged in a place that history will later call a garage, but that you will always remember as the place where you learned how to endure, how to focus, and how to keep going, even when the future was nothing more than a fragile idea held together by long nights and stubborn hope. Right before you discover that the real test starts when the garage door closes behind you, and the path ahead demands that you prove in a much louder world whether what you built in silence can survive the noise, and whether you are ready to face what happens next as the sentence of this journey continues without pause, carrying you forward into a phase where everything will be questioned, including whether you were right to believe back then in that small, uncertain space that this could become something more. Because now, as you step beyond those walls, the comfort of obscurity is gone, and the next chapter begins at the exact moment when the story leaves that garage behind and moves into a world that will test every assumption you made, every shortcut you took, and every lesson you thought you had learned. And it is here, right at this threshold, that the journey pauses briefly. Mid-thought, mid-breath, as you realize that what comes next will determine whether those humble beginnings become legend or remain just another forgotten experiment. Because the sentence does not end here. It continues into the next phase where everything is at stake, and where the real cost of growth is about to reveal itself as you step forward, and the story moves on unfinished into what awaits beyond that door, where the next truth is waiting, and the journey demands that you keep going even now, even as the garage fades into memory and the future presses in, asking you to prove whether you are ready for what comes next. As the sentence continues unbroken into the next part of this story, where the stakes rise and the lessons deepen, and you move forward, knowing that nothing will ever feel as simple again, because the garage was only the beginning, and the road ahead will require more than survival. It will require transformation. And that realization settles in as the thought trails off right here, leaving the sentence open because the journey itself is not done yet. And what comes next will test everything you built when no one was watching. And that test is about to begin as the story carries on, as the door shuts behind you, and the noise of the world rushes in louder, harsher, and far less forgiving than the silence you just left. Because the moment a company steps out of a garage and into visibility, the rules change without warning, and everything that once felt scrappy now looks unprofessional. Everything that once felt flexible now looks fragile. And the founder discovers that the shelter of obscurity is gone for good. This is where many of those humble beginnings quietly die, not because the product stops working, but because the weight of expectation crushes what was built to survive, not to perform under a spotlight. I've watched founders who were brilliant in isolation struggle the moment investors, media, and early customers began projecting their own fantasies onto the company, because suddenly the story mattered as much as the substance, and maintaining that story became another job layered onto an already exhausted mind. The garage taught you how to endure scarcity, but it did not teach you how to endure attention. And attention has a way of distorting priorities, pulling focus toward appearances, speed, and promises that feel harmless in the moment and lethal later. This is the phase where tech giants are either truly born or quietly unravel, because growth demands a different discipline than invention, a different patience than survival. The founders who make it through this transition are not the ones who cling hardest to the mythology of their beginnings, but the ones who are willing to let that version of themselves go, to admit that the instincts that served them in a cramped room may now be liabilities in a growing organization. I remember the discomfort of hiring the first layers of management, of realizing that leadership now meant creating clarity for others, rather than being the source of all answers. And that shift felt like another loss, another small death of the identity I had built around being indispensable. This is where ego becomes expensive, where the refusal to delegate turns into bottlenecks, burnout, and missed opportunities, and where the cost of learning lessons learned is measured not in sleepless nights, but in lost trust. The untold truth of this phase is that scaling exposes character faster than any early hardship, because there is no room to hide behind effort alone. And intentions mean very little when outcomes affect hundreds or thousands of people. I've seen companies with promising beginnings implode because founders could not evolve emotionally, because they confused loyalty with complacency, because they protected early relationships at the expense of future health, and the market punished them without hesitation. This is also where compromise enters the story in subtle ways, in terms sheets that look generous until control slips in partnerships that promise acceleration, but quietly redirect the company's soul, and in decisions made under the banner of growth that later feel like betrayals of the original purpose. The garage never prepared you for these moral negotiations, for the gray areas where there is no clearly right answer. Only trade-offs you must own long after the applause fades. And yet this is also where something solid can finally take shape, where the chaos of early creation condenses into structure, where values, if you are brave enough to define and defend them, become anchors instead of slogans. The tech giants we admire today survived this phase because their founders learned to choose deliberately to say no more, often than yes, to protect focus even when opportunity knocked loudly, and to accept slower, healthier growth over explosive expansion that would have torn the company apart. I've learned that leaving the garage is less about entering success and more about entering accountability, because from this point on, every flaw is amplified, every shortcut exposed, and every weakness tested under pressure. The romance of beginnings evaporates quickly, replaced by the grind of consistency, compliance, and coordination. And this is where many founders quietly wish for the simplicity of that dusty room, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. Still, if you endure this stage with humility, a different kind of confidence emerges, one not based on potential, but on proof, on systems that work, teams that function, and decisions that hold up under stress. You begin to understand that the true legacy of Garage Beginnings is not the story itself, but the foundation it provided for handling what came after. And that foundation only matters if you continue to build on it, rather than worship it. Eventually, the garage becomes a footnote, a line in a biography, and what defines the company is not where it started, but how it grew, how it treated people, and how it responded when growth exposed its flaws. The founders who last are those who resist the temptation to freeze their identity at the moment of origin, who allow themselves to change, to mature, to let the company become something bigger and more complex than the original idea. This is the quiet triumph hidden inside many tech giants' stories, the willingness to evolve without erasing the lessons of scarcity, to carry forward the disciplined focus and resilience forged in tight spaces, while shedding the fear that once dictated every move. When I look back now, the garage does not feel like a birthplace of greatness. It feels like a training ground, a harsh but necessary environment that taught me how to operate when nothing was guaranteed. And the greatest lesson it gave me was this: beginnings do not define outcomes, adaptation does. If you are standing in your own version of a garage right now, whether it is a literal room or a mental space of constraint and doubt, understand that its value lies not in its symbolism, but in what it is teaching you about focus, endurance, and honesty. And if you are stepping beyond it, feeling both relief and fear, know that what comes next will test you in new ways. But everything you learned when no one was watching is about to matter more than ever. If this story spoke to you, if it mirrored a phase you are living through or approaching, then subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the realities behind startup myths together. And leave a comment sharing what your own garage has taught you so far. Because these lessons, when spoken honestly, have a way of lighting the path for others who are still working in silence.